Today, we are joined by Amanda Janoo. Amanda is the Knowledge and Policy Lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. She's an economic policy expert, and her work aims to build just and sustainable economies through goal-oriented and participatory policy design processes. Thank you, Amanda, for joining us today. We are so glad to have you on our panel. My first question to you would be, successful economic growth and well-being are generally seen as opposed to each other, as the former is structured around infinite growth. How do you work with the challenge of reconciling the two? While this is possible, there are structures which inhibit this, as well-being is often seen as holding back on the n number of possibilities. How do you work on creating a space for both?
Such an important question, because I think it really brings us down to the fundamental issue of what the purpose of the economy is. Because the economy is ultimately just a word that we use to describe the way we produce and provide for one another. And so it's an activity, it's a means, it's a way in which we try to improve our quality of life. And so theoretically, there shouldn't be any conflict between economic growth and well-being. But the problem is that somewhere along the way, we really started to confuse means and ends, where we started to evaluate our economy's success by the level of wealth that is generated through producing goods or providing services to one another, rather than the level of well-being that is generated through those activities. And so this has led to a situation where we now treat people and planet as if they're here to serve the economy, rather than recognizing the reality that it's here to serve us. And so the Wellbeing Economy movement is really founded in that recognition, and it really advocates for designing and evaluating our economies by their contribution to human and ecological well-being. So this really means, when we have GDP growth as our aim, we have ended up encouraging and rewarding large corporations or investors or entrepreneurs that are really viewed as the most efficient at generating profits and wealth that are important for GDP. But once we flip the script and we really say, well, actually, it's about well-being, and that's really our vision of progress, and that's what matters most, then we start to think about different kinds of economic activities and behaviors that are really, really important and efficient at generating well-being, for example. And so this is where we will start to see that our work as caregivers or artists or stewards of the earth as really valuable, because these are the economic activities that are directly contributing to social and ecological well-being. And so therefore, I think it's not so much a question of growth, but rather growth of what and why.
Thank you, Amanda. That was a very, very satisfactory and interesting take. So going to the next question, it's almost an extension of what you were speaking about. As those who are in the global south and have a repository of traditional knowledge and ways of life which are contrary to the somewhat universal, somewhat Eurocentric ways of understanding well-being, how do you and the organization work around the challenge of creating the discursive disruption needed for decolonial ways of seeking growth? What are the challenges that you face in doing so, if there are any?
I mean, this is actually honestly a question that is so pertinent for me. I worked in international development for over a decade, so working across Asia and Africa in particular. And I just moved back to the United States, where I'm from, this past year. And one of the things that has been so striking for me is the level of anxiety and depression here. So I know that it's spreading worldwide, but there's something just so deep inside in this system that, we're supposedly the richest, most successful country in the world, but it's making us miserable. Yeah. And everybody feels like it's their fault, that they need to work harder or exercise more or meditate more, in order to alleviate that. But when so many people are feeling this and it's pervasive throughout the society, then you realize there's something really problematic about the way that we've built this system that is actually infecting, our hearts and our souls. And so now, having shifted from working in international development to now working in the Wellbeing Economy movement, it is very much currently being driven by countries and communities in the global north. And I think there's a good reason for this, right? Because I think countries such as mine, although the Wellbeing Economy movement is not strong enough yet here, but in very high income countries, they are experiencing this existential crisis, right? Where they have built economies and societies that are really good at generating wealth, but it's making them miserable, right? And the planet is on fire and we all have to stand 6 feet apart from one another. And so there's this question of like, what is all of this for? And so I do feel that the majority of the responsibility does need to be held by the global north because they have built this system, right? And they do need to transform it in order to develop alternative visions and structures and narratives for global development. But I think really critically, and to your point, I do not believe that the blueprints for that better system are going to come from the global north, but rather from the global south, because it's not an issue of just technical fixes. It's ultimately a cultural one of how do we want to live together on this planet? How do we want to interact and connect with one another? How do we want to provide for one another? And I think that the examples that we're going to find that are really going to help societies like mine to find again some peace and some connection and some meaning and purpose is going to come from reconnecting, I think, to a lot of those traditional cultural understandings and ways of living together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you said. I think it's really one of the most, I think at this point, one of the most important questions that we deal with, right? So going to the next one, as a policy expert, what would you consider are the main requirements when we envision sustainable economies based on the idea of well-being?
So I think there's maybe two different parts to this. So one is, what does an economy that is like a sustainable economy based on well-being really look like, right? And so and then the other part is, what are the prerequisites for policy in order to sort of shape and mold and build such an economy? And so first of all, and I think probably very, is we need our economy to be regenerative by design, right? So if this is about producing and providing for one another, we need to recognize that if every single thing around us, right, has been produced and given from the earth, then we have a responsibility to give back, right? And so we need to build an economic system where we are giving as much as we are taking, not only to one another, but to our natural environment as well, and to use our creative energies and our time and our ingenuity in order to really revitalize our natural world. And importantly, it also needs to be pre-distributive. We're in a system right now where we try to grow our economy so we can take some of that wealth through taxes to try to fix some of the damages that are done to people and planet in the process, right? And it's not a very efficient way of doing this, as opposed to really thinking about the fact that when we're producing things together or we're working together in collaboration, how do we ensure that there's fair distributions of voice, of power, and of the wealth and the opportunities that come from that collaboration, so that the economic enterprise through cooperatives or social enterprises, there's a lot of different ways in which we can collaborate without there being exploitation of each other or perceived ownership of one another. And I think those are some of the prerequisites. But when we think about policy is really the way in which we influence our behavior, through collective decisions about what kinds of behaviors we want more or less of. And so we're in this really amazing moment, I think, where we're experiencing this paradigm shift, right? Where people are really awakening and questioning what matters in the world. And so when there's some really great statistics, for example, which I'll just talk about very quickly, right? So one is, in 2 years ago, in 2020, there was a survey that illustrated that over half of the world believes that capitalism is doing more harm than good right now. And in India, that's actually was up at, I think, 74%, right? So a lot of people really recognize that there's a problem with our current economic system. But then just this past year, like in 2021, there was another survey that illustrated that in the G20 countries, the countries that are supposed winners of this whole system, right? Nearly 3/4 of people want their national economic priorities to move beyond profit and growth, to really prioritize the well-being of people and, ecological protection. So that's a shift from not just recognizing a problem to seeing the solution, right? And so the will is there, the recognition is there, but what we need are more participatory methods of decision making, right? Because if we just wait and vote and wait for other people to sort of make these decisions for us, then that's, not going to be sufficient. I think we need the agency. And so this is about governance reform, revitalizing democracy, providing spaces through citizens' assemblies and community discussions, forums, participatory budgeting, all of these things where our voices, we can feel we have a power over the shape and form of the economy. And I think the other prerequisite, which is a tough one, is really about a mindset shift, where right now government almost always starts from a problem-based approach, right? So we look and we try to see what the problem is and we try to fix it, right? And we think about, okay, well, here's the problem and what are we lacking that is causing this problem? As opposed to starting with a strength-based approach of what do we value and what do we really want to achieve and what's already existing within our society that can be the foundation and be built upon in order to grow and achieve that. And in some way, that's sort of like the deficit to abundance mindset shift, but it's also really just about the processes by which we make decisions and the things in which we look at as the foundations for the better world we envision. And so those are some of the prerequisites, I'd say, for a well-being economy.
Thank you. Those are very interesting points that you came up with. Thank you so much. So going to the last question, how do you envision the well-being movement going forth in the future while Indigenous communities are coming forward with their aspirations of more equitable growth, of less capitalistic growth, but yet capitalist growth is still one of the main drivers and communities still face increasing threat around the world. So how can governments be made to accede to the growth of communities as opposed to what can be considered the growth of economies?
Yeah, I mean, I really love the point around Indigenous communities, because something that's important to me to just maybe mention here is that I am continuously amazed by how quickly the wellbeing economy movement is growing. Yeah, there is, and the wellbeing movement more generally, but the term well-being is not necessarily universal, right? I think across different languages and cultures, you'll have a different term for what it means to have collective flourishing, right? And so in Latin America, there's this term buen vivir that comes from the indigenous communities to recognize a vision of harmony with ourselves, with one another, and with our natural environment, or Ubuntu, which comes from East Africa, around this idea that I am because you are, right? And so I think so much of this is around that recognition of our inherent interconnection, and that none of us can be well unless we all are well, right? And to start embracing that as a starting point for the ways in which we want to provide for one another on the planet, and in which way. And so when we think about how do we seed governments, I think working with governments all over the world, we require a top-down and bottom-up simultaneous strategy, right? So even national governments that we think of having a lot of power often are really constrained by our global economic system, right? So we've allowed, for example, our global economic system being largely driven by multinational corporations and their decisions and their interests. And oftentimes, especially smaller states, don't feel that they have the capacity to really transform the economy or to have the agency that they would want to have in these decisions. And so at the highest level, like my vision and hope is that we can really start to advocate for the kind of reforms that are needed at the global level to make space for greater self-determination. So things like global competition legislation, where you just break up, the largest, corporations and the largest, sectors, nearly every single sector in the world right now is being controlled by less than 4 companies. Yeah. So, I mean, there's like a need to just, break it up, disperse power in some way, but ultimately that will create space. But ultimately what's going to drive and allow us to build economies that are a true reflection of our values and our history and our context and our resources and all of these things is through bottom-up action. And so right now, one of the really exciting things in our work at We All is we're creating these place-based hubs. So we have hubs in locations where we have members all over the world, and there's a lot throughout Europe and increasing numbers in Latin America, and some starting in Africa and in India. Actually, we're just about to start and build a We All hub, and it's where there's energy, it's where there's interest, and where stakeholders from across society, where you have government and business and NGOs and academics who recognize we need this shift and can advocate for those kind of shifts that are aligned with the context, right? Because it's not a one size fits all sort of situation, right? And so I think through grassroots mobilization and vision, we can achieve those kinds of transformations that are needed by government.
Thank you, Amanda. And very interesting about the Indigenous Hub that you were speaking about. If on the day of the chat, if there is any more information that you would like to share, you can just drop it in the chat box so anybody can go and access it if they want. With that, our interview comes to an end. Thank you, Amanda, so much for joining us. It was such a pleasure to have you on our panel. And thank you for answering us in so much of detail. It was very, very interesting to listen to you.
Oh, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.